G'day guys and gal. I've been doing a lot of 40k and a few fantasy videos recently, but where are the Age of Sigmar videos I hear nobody ask? Well, here it is. Here is your Age of Sigmar video. If you've heard about Age of Sigmar, you've probably heard bad things about it. I personally took a steaming dump on it when I explained its lore all those years ago, and unfortunately for my relationship with Games Workshop, that is the #1 Age of Sigmar video on the internet. But does it deserve all the hate it gets? Has it evolved to a solid standard since its launch, or are all the haters right, and should the GW writing team be lined up and systematically executed via chainsaw? Before we get started, I have a question for you. Do you miss Warhammer Fantasy? Do you crave a well-crafted story reminiscent of classic Warhammer? Are you gay? Well, if at least 2 out of 3 of those are a yes, then I am happy to announce that Journeys Through Faladon, Titan's Divide is now live and available for sale on Amazon. It's a book I wrote with 39 other authors / Warhammer nerds, and despite sounding like an abomination, is actually fantastic. The paperback version is available soon, however if you want to get it now it's only $5. The first couple pages are readable for free and the entire book is 277 pages, so solid but not over the top. Today we'll discuss the various parts of Age of Sigmar, its lore, its models and its gameplay, and why people hated or liked each part. I'll then give my own thoughts on how Games Workshop could have avoided the backlash they copped. Also, we are only 895,324 subscribers away from 1 million. So close. So if you crack a laugh or smile during this video, then consider chucking me your subscription. The more people we overtake in subscribers, the more I can stoke my own ego. So you know, it's for a good cause. Coming for you next, Valrak. Let's get into it. A big issue with Age of Sigmar wasn't the setting itself. No, it was the fact that it replaced Warhammer Fantasy in a very rough way. Warhammer Fantasy was like a tree that hadn't been watered in a very long time. It was vast and powerful, but dying. The fans were like, GW, please water this tree. And GW were like, we could do that, or we could sodomize it with an axe and then replant it. Hence the end times were created, an epically terrible send-off for an ancient beloved world, where characters acted weirdly or were ignored entirely, and the Skaven were retardedly overpowered. The tree of fantasy fell and it was burned, its ashes used to fertilize Age of Sigmar, which represents a small flower, pretty to look at but didn't really add much, especially since the much larger flower bush of Warhammer 40k was next to it. I'm going to stop using plant analogies now as I'm beginning to confuse myself, but I hope you know the point I'm trying to make. Starting us off with the lore. Age of Sigmar is a direct sequel to Warhammer Fantasy and kinda sits in this awkward phase of wanting to be vastly different, however uses a lot of the characters from Fantasy in order to play upon people's nostalgia and draw connections. The issue arises when the characters they brought over to Age of Sigmar are so different to how they are in Warhammer Fantasy that they may as well have just created new ones. Alariel goes from a wise, big-hearted defender of the elves to a dirty hippie bitch, and don't get me started on Malekith, who is now a chaos god. Like, what? This can be forgiven, however, as the Age of Sigmar setting is a solid high fantasy setting in terms of lore. The issue, however, always comes back to its connection to Warhammer Fantasy battles. Even if Age of Sigmar's lore was bulletproof, it would still have copped the tide of hatred as a result of the violent, unconsensual finger blasting of the Warhammer world. First impressions matter, and the first impression of Age of Sigmar was, hi, fantasy is dead. This is also why the hatred of Age of Sigmar lore has burnt out quite a bit in recent times. People can only be mad at a first impression for so long before they get over it. If GW had treated fantasy a bit better and made the end times lore better, like I've been trying to do with the series of mine, then Age of Sigmar wouldn't have eaten all the backlash from the end times. Another big gripe a lot of people have with Age of Sigmar is that it's too shiny now, too clean and not grimdark enough. Stormcast Eternals don't really bleed, and even the Core Knight Warriors look like they were created by Chaos Dwarves with OCD about clean armor and symmetry. Even the undead look a bit clean. Everyone's just a fucking space marine now. GW have more or less also killed off Slaanesh. That's right, the elven gods trapped Slaanesh in a hidden realm so there was no more of that hardcore grim darkness brought upon by indulgence, drug use or sexual violence that Slaanesh usually brings. Nurgle, Titsnitch and Khorne were always a bit cartoony with their grim darkness, but Slaanesh was actually relatable to real life problems, so it adds that extra layer of creepiness, especially with how subtly Slaanesh could infect your life. Sure, there are still a lot of elements of grim darkness like the Stormcast Eternals slowly falling to dementia, or the fact that the only two afterlives in Age of Sigmar is becoming Nagash's bitch or getting nommed by chaos, but that pales to the horrors of some of the stuff that goes on in Fantasy or 40k. I don't necessarily think Age of Sigmar being a bit lighter and less of dark of a setting is a bad thing, if, it was a standalone setting. As we've discussed previously, Warhammer is a lot more than just grim darkness, and the excessive use of the theme in the past has produced some retarded stuff. However, it's still a huge part of Warhammer, and it raises some red flags within the community when the sequel to Warhammer Fantasy represents a notable shift away from some of the more twisted and dark parts Warhammer has to offer. In saying that though, as the lore begins to settle more and more and it's fleshed out, it is apparent that GW want grimdarkness to remain a big theme of Age of Sigmar. The Idoneth Deep King are a good example, as the vast majority of them have miscarriages and stillbirths, and the survivors look like they're on their 10th cycle of chemotherapy. Another good example is the fact that the setting starts with the good guys losing big time, and it's only now that they begin to crawl back and fight against the tide of chaos. But they still need to exercise a level of caution. Remember, Games Workshop, just because a story has themes or characters that represent bad traits and horrific scenes, doesn't mean your lore writers are bad people or that people will get offended. If everyone took everything I said seriously, then people would probably accuse me of being the demonic spawn of David Duke and Hitler. Overall, for the lore, people were mostly originally mad about the end of Warhammer Fantasy, and that anger was channeled towards Age of Sigmar. This wasn't helped by Age of Sigmar's shaky launch of the lore, which was a bit scattered. However, in recent times, the lore has been fleshed out and kinda knows what it wants to be now, hence making for a pretty solid setting lore-wise. Just because I like some of the things that the company who produces my hobby doesn't make me a kiss-ass who's trying to get into their good graces. Hating the creators of your hobby doesn't make you look cool or smart. It makes you look like a salty, resentful little cunt who should just move on with their life instead of being perpetually angry. To clarify that, as I can smell the greasy paws on some neckbeards' unwashed faces begin to open in rage, you can totally disagree and criticize decisions that GW make. But if hearing the name Games Workshop makes you shake your fists in anger, then maybe it's time to relax and reflect on why you allow little plastic toys to raise your already high blood pressure levels. Now we have covered the lore, what did people think about the actual gameplay? Well, this originally wasn't too well received for a number of valid reasons either. Firstly, Warhammer Fantasy and 40k played very differently. Fantasy was a lot more about large-scale, highly technical battles, using formations and thinking multiple turns ahead. Age of Sigmar is like a simplified 40k. This ties back into Age of Sigmar being solid as a standalone, but a downgrade in terms of a sequel. Another issue is that the General's Handbook was not available upon release for Age of Sigmar, hence there were no point values, making competitive play of Age of Sigmar impossible, and any casual games had different rules that had to be pre-arranged by the players. With the release of 2nd edition Age of Sigmar as well as the General's Handbook, it made the whole game a lot less shit, and much more playable, with a lot of people actually enjoying Age of Sigmar in terms of gameplay. A gameplay issue that some people like, but I think is GW going full retard in Age of Sigmar, is the random turns. In Fantasy, it was turn 1, player 1, turn 2, player 2, turn 3, player 1, and so on. In Age of Sigmar, it could go like this: turn 1, player 1, turn 2, player 2, turn 3, player 2. Hence, you could be getting consecutive turns, adding a whole nother layer of randomness to the game and making it very difficult to plan ahead, as maybe your charge will only work if your units don't get raped from a long range for 2 turns in a row, or maybe your master plan will only work if you yourself get 2 turns in a row. Luck can be fun and save the day. It can also be a bitch and ruin your day. I'm in the boat that prefers my strategy games to be 85% skill and 15% luck. Overall though, I'm not a tabletop player, so I'm definitely missing out on some points here. So if you have anything to add to Age of Sigmar's gameplay and why people do or don't like it, then let me know in the comments below. Finally, we have the miniatures themselves. While there was initially a lot of memes about Stormcast Eternals being Sigmar's homebrew Space Marine chapter, or the Sigmarines, the models are very solid and I think we can all agree on that. Fortunately, a lot of fantasy minis were still valid and usable in Age of Sigmar, so it wasn't like you just chucked your whole army in the bin. Unless you were Tomb Kings or Bretonnia players, then ouch. Using those old fantasy minis alongside Age of Sigmar minis can be a bit jarring as well, as some of them, especially the Skaven and Lizardmen minis, haven't been updated in years. Some of them are even older than I am, and these are the go-to and most up-to-date models. It ties back into the issue that Age of Sigmar was created because Warhammer Fantasy wasn't making enough money, yet if they went balls to the walls on a 9th edition of Fantasy with up-to-date rules and models, it could have been equally if not more so effective from a financial standpoint. Now, gripes aside, there is no denying that the Age of Sigmar models are great. They look pretty next gen and show off just how far Warhammer has come. A positive to Age of Sigmar no longer being shackled to any kind of reality is that they can go balls to the walls with their models. I'm seeing a fair amount of Warhammer 40k kit bashes using bits from Age of Sigmar. These Blood Angels are a good example of that. Overall, the transition for the minis going from Fantasy to Age of Sigmar was not a smooth one. However, the models we have now and continue to be given are some of pretty top tier stuff, and they have never been a point of issue for Age of Sigmar. In conclusion, most of Age of Sigmar's hatred was due to the death of Warhammer Fantasy, as well as its pretty shitty launch. The whole thing just kinda screamed rushed. But, as people chill out and the launch fades into memory, Age of Sigmar stands as a pretty well regarded game that only seems to be improving from here. On top of that, Fantasy is on its way back. The success of Vermintide as well as Total War Warhammer created massive interest in the dead setting, so the people who still clung on to Fantasy are being given their favourite toy back. So how could GW avoid the shitstorm they created? There's a couple ways. Method 1 is to fuck it up less. More time and effort spent on the End Times lore and giving Warhammer Fantasy a more satisfying ending. Then, giving Age of Sigmar a better start, as well as the General's Handbook from day one would have solved a lot of issues. On top of that, they could have just chosen to use the hype from Total War Warhammer and Vermintide to revive the franchise and update the models and rules, creating 9th edition Warhammer Fantasy. Vermintide came out the same year as Age of Sigmar, and Total War Warhammer was only a year after that, so it's not like it was too late, they would have been discussing and planning those games for a while. Either way, 40k is the best it's been, Age of Sigmar is pretty acceptable at this point, and Fantasy is coming back. All in all, not a bad time to be a Warhammer fan. And that does us for today guys, why people dislike Age of Sigmar and why it may, or may not, have deserved the hate. A lot of this video is me explaining both sides and playing a little bit of devil's advocate. I'm pretty indifferent to Age of Sigmar overall, which is obvious by me rarely covering it, so I'm not as invested in it and its shortcomings as much as I am in Fantasy and 40k. If you enjoyed the video, want to see some quality booby pics, not kidding that they are there, then Patreon is the place to be. Only $1 gives you access to a boatload of Warhammer hentai, and $10 gives you access to the Majorkill hentai calendar. Hit the subscribe button, then hit the real subscribe button for more hated content. Join the Discord for more memes, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.